Welcome to this first in a series of videos that I'll be making about Ukraine and topics related to the war. I've held off on entering this information space before now because wars are confusing, and especially this one. As I researched, I found that there is so much content that the name TikTok war, which has been used to describe this war, is in fact quite apt. There's simply so much stuff out there already, and given the gravity of this subject, I wanted to spend a lot of time researching and treating everything with the gravity that this subject deserves before I published anything. I had wanted to get this video out earlier, and I promised some of you that I would, and I do know that, but the fall of Bakhmut and the F-16 donations interrupted my plans in that regard. I had to rewrite my script to include all those events and my analysis of them. First, I'd like to clarify what this video is not. It is not propaganda, but objective analysis. Minimizing a Russian success is simply bad analysis. This is a situation is as it is. The situation is not as we would wish it to be. I'll cover it as it is. This is not an opinion masquerading as fact. I've included a list of my sources in the description. I'd like to take a note here to talk about my sources briefly. Because Russia does not tend to publish the reports of its government or its think tanks, I'm using primarily Western, non-governmental sources. I in particular found the work of Watling and Reynolds at RUSI to be excellent, along with that of Konrad Mazeuka at Roshchan and the entire team at the Institute for the Study of War. This is finally not a leak. All the information that I present here is open source intelligence that's already available. What's classified stays classified. Thug Shaker Central. The weekend's biggest news was the loss of Bakhmut, and so I thought that it was appropriate to begin there. The battle here lasted for 244 days before it finally ended on Sunday. It's the second longest battle in world history and missed Verdun by only 2 weeks. In proportion to the numbers engaged, it was nearly as deadly as Verdun. It took the lives of tens of thousands of Russians and thousands of Ukrainians by all accounts. This, for sheer raw violence, this is like nothing we have seen in the 21st century. It is like something out of the Second World War. The image up there on the screen is not a Photoshop creation. It is not a post-apocalyptic landscape. That is what Bakhmut currently looks like. I think we can all agree that the place has suffered enough. Now, the fall of Bakhmut is a clear Ukrainian defeat. This is especially the case given the immense political capital that Zelensky and his administration invested in holding the city. It is, however, by no means decisive. Without a full commitment of Ukraine's reserves to hold Bakhmut, the place was doomed from at least the fall of Soledar and Krasnohora back in January. Ukrainian forces were not routed, they withdrew in good order, and they dug in at their next lines at Chasiv Yar. I am aware that the Russian Channel 1 claims that Russian troops, after taking Bakhmut, felt like their grandfathers in Berlin. Now, last I checked, Zelensky hasn't shot himself yet, so I feel confident as saying that Bakhmut is nowhere near as decisive. The real question now is whether Wagner will withdraw or not. Prigozhin has announced that he will pull back and refit starting on May 25th. Of course, Prigozhin has also claimed this on numerous other occasions and stayed in the line. Should Prigozhin now withdraw, then this will create a hole in the line that other Russian units will have to cover. I will say that Bakhmut has fallen, and so a Wagner pullback seems more plausible now than it did in April or earlier this month. But I think that Wagner will stay on the line. The disadvantages of removing it without ready replacements that are available are simply too obvious even to a fool like Shoigu. Especially as Ukraine gears up for its counteroffensive, Russia needs every man on the line to stop it, and certainly does not need to be dealing with any unauthorized retreats at this time. Wagner did take heavy losses at Bakhmut, especially amongst its convict cannon fodder. How Wagner absorbs its replacements is vital because it will give a clue as to the Kremlin's reconstitution plans for its forces. Aside from September of 2022, when mobilization was clearly desperately needed and undertaken as an almost desperation measure to keep the war going, Putin has shrank from outright mobilization. That's quite understandable given the chaos of last September, and I want to emphasize chaos. We saw millions of men drop everything and run for the Russian border. We saw millions of others go on to hiding. We saw everybody from the babushkas in their head wraps to young urban professionals complaining on Telegram about conditions and so on and so forth. Clear societal discontent here. Instead of trying all that again, Putin has opted for what the Ukrainians call crypto mobilization. This takes the form of PMCs, or private military companies. Wagner is the most infamous of these, but it is not alone in the private military company world, which are raised by promises of hefty financial rewards for service in Ukraine. Whether any of the men in those units will see their promised financial rewards is something else entirely. Finally, it consists of forced mobilization in the Russian prison system and in the DNR-LNR puppet states. Both of these methods are now known as the land of women because of their results in the DNR and LNR. I'll leave for you to figure out why Donetsk and Luhansk may be now called that. This approach does generate some recruits, but nowhere near enough of them to match the remorseless losses that are being suffered in the positional warfare you find in this war. Putin has two options to address this. He can either try mobilization of more men, or he can try to plug the gaps with short-term measures. Given his past actions, he will likely choose option 2 if possible, even if it depletes his strength doing so until he has no alternative but to declare another round of forced mass mobilization. You will probably see the Bakhmut rehabilitation program taken away from Wagner, which has already happened, and you will most likely see it expanded in the Russian prison system. Russia's next goal, territorially speaking on the battlefields, after Bakhmut is unclear, but if they want to continue on the Bakhmut axis, Chasiv Yar is up next. Now, I would like to make a little note here that this is the front line as of August 1st last year, the start of the battle for Bakhmut. Russian forces were around Pokrovsk. Now, the measurements to Kromova, which is on the outskirts of Bakhmut and as to Russian forces have advanced right now, shows that the distance between these two in a straight line is 14 kilometers, or about 8 freedom units if you happen to be operating in the United States. So, we have taken 10 months to advance 8 miles on Russian forces. So we are averaging less than a mile per month. We are averaging about 0.8 miles per month. The distance from Kromova to Chasiv Yar is about 6 miles. Given Russia's present rates of advance, they will reach Chasiv Yar sometime in November. So clearly, the Spezielle Uvayina Operazione is going completely to plan, and nothing at all is wrong. It was not the only thing that happened around the settlement over the past week. Starting about 10 days ago, Ukraine attacked the flanks of Bakhmut in an effort to roll back the Russian advances there and prevent an encirclement of the town. These attacks were revealing in the sense that they revealed Russian failures. As I mentioned before, Russians took enormous casualties in the fight to capture Bakhmut, and that adversely affected morale. Now, Russian formations themselves did not collapse. Russian forces now, as historically, have possessed an enormous ability to maintain cohesion and stay together in the face of almost unimaginable pounding. But Russian lapses in morale manifested themselves in failure to communicate between units, in failure to trust other units, for Wagner Group, for example, to trust the Russian army units on its flanks, and this can be seen in the blame game that played out in the Russian information space after the retreats were necessary. And so, if we look at the tactical map again, we can see the objective of Ukraine's forces. Ukraine attacked in the north of Bakhmut here, at the Bodanivka reservoir right here, and rolled the Russians back by driving a wedge in their lines here. They then began to attack north as well at Orivo Vasilivka and Hanoharivka right there. To the south, Ukrainians made another larger advance, driving eastward from these lines towards the village of Klashivka. Now, the point of this is not so much to recapture Bakhmut. It is not so much to encircle Bakhmut, although that is what the Ukrainians would have you believe. The point of all this is to focus on the terrain and secure the high ground right here. So as we can see, the Ukrainian end objective is probably to reach this ridge, which runs towards Klashivka. You can see that the furthest Ukrainian advances are bringing themselves to the tip of this ridge here and here. Presumably, the objective is to secure the line here in the south, and then in the north, it is presumably to secure this to keep advancing, using the reservoir to secure the flank and secure this ridge and this massif up here. This will gain Ukrainian control of the high ground. It will prevent any further Russian advances on the flanks, and it will make the Russian advance towards Chasiv Yar nearly untenable if successfully completed. Now, the Ukrainian advances were halted because Russia deployed reinforcements from the south, presumably to Bakhmut, in order to halt them. However, this is perfectly fine by Ukrainian standards because deploying reinforcements achieves the goal of weakening the Russian forces in the south. Bakhmut is not really the Ukrainian counteroffensive, despite what some would have you believe. Nobody in Ukraine wants to advance through the absolute devastation that I just showed you of what Bakhmut is like. That would be very, very bad for logistics, and the offensive would grind to a halt. So, moving on to force generation in Ukraine. Now, early in the war, Ukraine's force generation was not really an issue. There was indeed a surplus of volunteers. There are rumors of some men actually paying bribes to join the territorial defense forces. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. The fact that it is even a rumor tells you what kind of war this is, because that is the sort of thing that should have died out in 1914. But as is the case in all wars, the war has dragged on, casualties have mounted, and nobody is really interested in volunteering. Since, of course, Ukraine must fill the ranks, this has meant a reversion to conscription in various waves. There has also been an attempt to standardize the flow of replacements. At the start of the invasion, many groups simply formed small independent assault battalions or militias, and the entire situation was very chaotic. Nobody really knew what was going on. Kyiv handed out 18,000 assault rifles to citizens of the capital, and no one really knew what happened to the men who picked them up. So, since then, there has been an effort to coordinate to get these men back into the ranks. You have seen a standardization that is ongoing. A large number of small units of squad and platoon size have been consolidated into companies, companies into battalions, battalions into entirely new brigades. We are seeing further a dual-track approach to manpower replacement and equipment replaces. By a dual-track approach to manpower, I mean that individual replacements are being supplied to fighting units, but in addition, entirely new units are being formed. So the successes of this approach will allow Ukraine both to keep the units on the line at full strength, while also simultaneously generating new ones to participate in the upcoming counteroffensive. By a dual-track approach to equipment, I mean that we are seeing Western equipment deployed in two ways. We are seeing some Western equipment concentrated together in brigade formations. We are seeing other Western equipment spread across the front. For example, we are seeing Britain's Challenger 2 tanks grouped together into companies and assigned to brigades. So one brigade, Brigade 82, has all the Challenger 2 tanks that Britain has given to Ukraine. These are being deployed across the front. For example, the United States' M777 towed howitzers that have been sent to Ukraine. Each one has been given to a different artillery brigade, so each artillery brigade will have about a battery, or in some cases maybe a few batteries, and this gives each artillery unit the ability to engage Russian forces deeper in the rear. Finally, we are seeing two new corps that are in the process of formation to command these new units that are being generated. We are seeing 9th and 10th, both headquartered deeper in the rear for obvious reasons. I will not tell you where. We are seeing them, and each of them will probably control about 4 to 5 brigades in this upcoming counteroffensive. The other biggest news of the weekend was the arrival of F-16s to Ukraine. They will actually arrive in about 4 months. The pilots will need to be trained on them. And Western experts believe that it will take about 4 months to train experienced Ukrainian pilots which have already previously flown in combat on these planes. Novice Ukrainian pilots will still take months or even years to train. This is, in no uncertain terms, an absolute game changer for Ukraine. Will not the war win, and I don't want any illusions about that, because they will not, but in access to the weaponry they will carry. Specifically, F-16s would be useless unless supplied without Western air-to-air missiles, unless of course you are planning on engaging the Russians, Manfred von Richthofen style, which I do believe nobody plans on doing. The reason Western air-to-air missiles are so important is because right now, Ukraine's jets carry early Soviet-era air-to-air missiles. These missiles cannot track and guide independently. That means to engage a Russian target, the Ukrainian pilot must keep the aircraft pointed directly at the target so the missile can ride the aircraft's radar beam to the destination target. Western air-to-air missiles don't have this problem. They can guide independently. That means they can be fired and released. In addition, Western air-to-air missiles are much longer ranged. I believe that AMRAAM air-to-air medium-range missiles, depending on the configuration that will be supplied to Ukraine, have a maximum range of up to 120 kilometers, or around 80 miles give or take, possibly more. Since currently, Ukraine's pilots are struggling to engage outside much of 20 or 30 kilometers due to the short range of their missiles, then this will be obviously an absolute game changer. It will deepen the employment depth by about a factor of 4 and push Russian forces back. It will, essentially, for the first time since the opening days of the war, give Ukrainian pilots an ability to credibly threaten the Russian Air Force in the skies over Ukraine. The ability of the Ukrainian Air Force to do this will relieve some pressure on the extremely hard-pressed Ukrainian air defenses. It will reduce their ammunition consumption. It will free them up for other things. And this is vital because the vast majority of Ukraine's air defenses rely on Soviet missiles. We have been buying up every Soviet missile in the world and sending it to Ukraine, but there's only a finite stockpile, and because as the majority of these missiles are made by Russia. Now, outside of a few incidents, like the Russian Kharkiv retreats back last September, Russia has not seen fit to donate a large number of weapons to Ukraine. So anything that takes pressure off the dwindling Ukrainian ammo supply for its surface-to-air missile batteries is most certainly a good thing. Additionally, the flexibility of these new air-to-air missiles on these F-16s will allow the Ukrainians to begin defending their capital with aircraft instead of surface-to-air missiles. They will be able to use their own aircraft to shoot down Russian drones and cruise missiles instead of relying on their surface-to-air missiles to do it, which will further reduce the pressure on Ukraine's surface-to-air batteries. Perhaps the biggest proof of the use of air power comes from the German general of World War II, Erwin Rommel, when he pointed out that fighting the Allies, who had air superiority, was like fighting with one foot nailed to the ground. In no way, no NATO general would be asked to conduct a counteroffensive of the kind we are asking Ukraine to undertake without adequate air support. F-16 will not guarantee adequate air support. There are no certainties in war, but it will help tremendously. F-16 will also allow the HARM missiles sent to Ukraine to be used in the way they were originally intended. HARM, because it is a Western missile, does not currently interface well with the computers on Ukraine's MiG-29 Soviet-era jets. Western and Soviet systems were designed not to talk to each other. They were in fact designed to shoot at each other. So right now, Ukraine is using its HARM missiles in almost autonomous mode. That is, they're fired, they pop up, they circle, they find the target, and then they engage the target. However, being tied into Western jets, as they were intended, will allow the fighters' computers to control the attack profile, the electronic warfare profile, and all the pilot will have to do is acquire and press a button. This will mean that the missile does not have to loiter in the air before finding a target. It also means that the missile can be enormously more capable in its attack profile and flight plan, and therefore used to its fullest capability. This is key because Russia has been shooting down a good many HARMs lately, and Ukraine must use HARMs to suppress Russia's actually excellent surface-to-air missile sites. Finally, the biggest advantage of F-16s is that there is a sizable pool of replacements for them. They are used by almost every country in Europe as the backbone of their air force, including by many countries who are planning on removing those aircraft and using F-16s and using F-35s instead. So there will be a sizable pool of replacement fighters to provide spares from when, as inevitably happens, Ukrainian planes are lost in battle. I'd like to close out this week just by briefly covering the upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive. We don't know exactly when it will begin. Assessments vary. Konrad Mazeuka, who has done excellent work at Roshchan Consulting, believes that it has already started, given the use of Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles and the operations around Bakhmut. I personally do not buy that. To me, that counts as more shaping operations for the counteroffensive than the actual counteroffensive itself. We will, however, certainly know that the offensive goes in when we see some signs. One of the key signs will be the deployments of the 116th and 118th Brigades into actual combat. They are some of the units that have been formed and trained over the winter by Ukraine and by the West. They are in Zaporizhzhia right now. When they are seen in combat, that is a sure sign that the counteroffensive has begun. An absolute guarantee that the counteroffensive has begun is when we will see the 82nd Airborne Brigade take the field. The 82nd Airborne, called by the excellent American correspondent David Axe as ridiculously powerful, consists of a near majority of Ukraine's Western equipment. It is designed as the elite core of a formation and is presumably intended to punch right through the Russian lines. It comprises every Challenger 2 tank that has been sent to Ukraine, every Marder infantry fighting vehicle that has been sent to Ukraine, every Stryker infantry fighting vehicle that has been sent to Ukraine, and the whole thing backed up with Western artillery. It is completely outfitted as you would expect a Western brigade to be outfitted. Its troops are reportedly all volunteers drawn from other units, and its trainers are combat veterans from excellent brigades like the 95th Airborne, the 80th Airborne, and the 25th Airborne. These are hardcore guys. They are all volunteers drawn from other units. They are led by veterans. They are tasked with opening the way for every other force to come after them. The counteroffensive will likely be either Zaporizhzhia, which is what everyone expects, or Luhansk. Luhansk is attractive because the Russians may not be expecting it. It is an area where the Ukrainians have had success in the past at Kharkiv, and it is possible to roll up the Russian front in Donbass if the counteroffensive is swift enough. Zaporizhzhia is advantageous because a swift thrust to the coast will cut the Russian forces in two. I am sure that all of you have seen maps depicting these proposed operations, but just briefly, if we were to zoom out, then I will go over them again, just very briefly, and then we will close this video out. ISW's map can't take a while to load on occasion, you guys. It is the way it is. It just happens. But here, we can see the entire front line in bright red. The North Luhansk counteroffensive would begin, if our map loads, it would begin likely up here, or maybe here, at the P-26 highway. It would probably aim to reach Svatove Kremina right there, and then it would either continue directly on this road to Starobilsk, the main Russian logistics hub for the entirety of North Luhansk, or they would immediately pivot and swing south and try and trap the Russian forces fighting along here. That is one possibility. The reason why I think it unlikely is very simple. It has to do with the fact that there is, as you can see up here, virtually no good roads, and Ukraine and mechanized armies do tend to need roads. This area is very sparsely populated. Ukraine probably didn't see the effort in putting in good roads before the war. And that means the most likely counteroffensive will still be the one in the south, from Zaporizhzhia through Tokmak and Melitopol to the Black Sea, right here, the Sea of Azov, I should say, and the objective would be to cut the Russian forces in two. If this is cut, then Ukraine's Storm Shadow missiles can be used to nail the Kerch Bridge. Down here, all forces in western Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Crimea will promptly go on starvation rations, and then all forces can be eliminated at their leisure, after which all forces can be turned east and used to grind the Russians out of Donetsk and Luhansk one blasted mile at a time. That concludes my presentation for this week. I do hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Thank you again for coming, and I'll see you all next week.